Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today to talk about storytelling strategy. So in our design thinking series, we talked about storytelling with data in terms of conveying the human story. The human story that you find in ethnographic research done in that design thinking process and other methods, but mostly with the mind of developing a product or a program and how that relates to a population or a community of people you're working with. So we talked about some different things. We talked about qualitative methods to do this. We talked about quantitative, how you would use both of those things, what would make the most sense for your organization. But today I want to talk about storytelling kind of as its own entity. So storytelling as a word can give a feeling of fiction versus fact sometimes, but we're speaking of storytelling in the sense that we're weaving together data and personal accounts that support one another to provide a more comprehensive or illustrative look at a situation or an experience. So this term, it's also a popular tool in marketing, and this approach can lend itself to that, certainly. But we're talking today more about the use of storytelling to communicate facts and data. Even if it also benefits messaging in some kind, we're really starting with it as a route for conveying facts and information about your organization. So people connect to stories. Let me fix my slides for you guys. People connect to stories, in other words, information that is pulled together in such a way that it tells you something along the arc of a story. So if you think about even as facts or research or data, you're talking about something in terms of what we know in the beginning, what we learn, what the experience is, how that brings us along to a concluding kind of feeling or perspective or notion at the end. So thinking about it in terms of that kind of arc, no matter what the content is what helps to bring people along. So this is beneficial in terms of sharing research and data because it makes it more understandable and digestible. So it puts it in a framework that people are familiar with consuming information and stories in, and it takes something that they may not know a lot about yet and puts it in a familiar kind of framework. So it's a good way to bring audiences along for whatever your purpose is, whether that be communicating value and purpose of your organization, growing volunteerism, or gaining participants for some programs. So there's lots of benefits for it. So like I said, when we thought of storytelling in the context of the design thinking process, it was wrapped up in the objective of creating some new program, product, or service. But today, I want to talk about storytelling as its own entity, like I said, and its own objective or purpose. It may be that you're going to craft a narrative of data and experiences to communicate a message, to bring awareness to something or reach a new audience, or to bring people along in the work that you're doing with internal stakeholders, maybe to get some buy-in. Either to inform or maybe to inspire. So we'll talk a little bit more later about what attracts people to this process. But really it falls under research, marketing, art, and it can be moving in any of those areas when done well. So we used this slide when we talked about the design thinking process. So I just want to revisit it a little bit before we move on to some other aspects of storytelling. But like we talked about, when you construct your story, you want to consider some key elements. So this is broadly true in any avenue or purpose of storytelling. So I'll revisit them really quickly, and then you'll have this to refer back to. But you likely will want to determine your audience. So this will mostly inform all future decisions of how you approach your storytelling strategy, either retrospectively when you fine tune it or at the beginning. So given the audience or situation, you'll want to consider your presentation format as well. So this might be an in-person told story. It might be that you choose to share something digitally. either in a long format or short format, like on social media, in an interview style, and that might be something that is a live interview. You might do something like in a Zoom setting or in a meeting and bring someone along to interview, but it might also be pre-recorded and something that you share out in a more kind of viral kind of way, potentially. It could be through art, through data visualizations, through graphs and charts. There's lots of different ways, and I'm going to go into those a little bit more today than we did last time. So think about what will communicate the point of your story in the most economic way. So you don't want to share every single fact with every single audience, most likely, but really choose what's the most impactful and the most that's needed to be known. So, but above all, you want to make sure that your message is clear and that you don't lose your message in the process. So you can make choices about the intended audience and the platform, but don't let that skew your original purpose unless your original purpose has been enlightened by any of those things that those decisions that you've made. So this is a little bit like starting with the end in mind, but you'll come back to this once you've done the work of collecting the data and the stories. So one tactic that I like to use is to do somewhat of a self-survey. You can do this for just yourself individually, or you can do it for your team, whoever is working on this project. You could do it as an organization for those who are involved more loosely and those who are doing the actual story collection as well, and just do it as kind of a temperature check. But this is a nice initial step in the process to just take a quick assessment of yourself and see where you're at. It'll help determine kind of the direction of your project, but it won't restrain it too much. It'll help to actually open it up more. So there are lots of questions that you could ask yourself, and creating or crafting a list that makes the most sense for your specific organization or your process or your purpose will be most beneficial, more beneficial than the list I've probably provided you here, which is really general. But this is just a place to get you started. So some example questions would be, ask yourself why you're doing this in the first place. It may be that you've been asked to do it as part of your job, and that's fine. So if so, why is your organization, why is your employer asking you to do this? But because it's been a decision that has been brought to you as opposed to one that maybe you've made on your own, ask yourself, are you holding back, or are you hesitant or reserved about it in any way? Ask yourself, are you trying to achieve something by sharing this information? Likely you are. I mean, it could be completely exploratory, but likely you are trying to achieve some sort of end. You have some sort of end in mind in terms of a message you want to share, information you want to share. So who will that benefit? And then think too, would anyone possibly be hurt by that or compromised in some way? So maybe that speaks to some concerns. We're dealing with human beings and the human condition and services to people oftentimes. So it's important to really be aware of and mindful of, what story am I telling? Why am I telling it? Why is it important to share? And who will be impacted by it? So again, kind of speaking to that, is there anything that you're worried about? I think sometimes these questions of concerns and worries or a hesitancy to the process itself are underlying, and we don't address them, and we kind of push forward and we start to tell these stories, and we feel a little bit out of our comfort zone if this is like a new process for us, or a new group of people that you're communicating with, a new position at a job that you're doing this for. So I think getting some of those fears and concerns out early so you're aware of them can help move you through them. And then you can also reach out to people who are really skilled in these areas for support. So just kind of knowing where you stand at the start will help lay out your approach and make you more aware. And truthfully, I think the reason that I find this to be so beneficial is because the whole part of storytelling is to express some sort of experience. And so your experience with it will be threaded throughout, even if it's not the point of it. So it'll be more authentic that way. So there are a number of ways you can go about collecting your data and your stories that will make up the whole of the story you tell. And then there's a lot of ways to think about just what data is too. So you'll make choices along the way. But initially, you must think about your strategy. So are you going to approach this from more of a research methodology where you see where the stories and the data take you, you collect a bunch of information, you maybe have some hypothesis about what the message is going to be or what it might look like, but you really let all of the work that you put into collecting the information help to guide you toward what that final story or that final message is? Or are you going to determine at the outset what your message you'd like to share is and then seek out data and stories to support that? The latter sounds bad, but it's actually not. If you were doing like a rigorous research study, it's probably not the way that you would go. But we're talking here about really leveraging research strategies and tools for the purposes of what you need to do in your organization. And I think that's okay because you're going to remain mindful about why you're doing this right from the start. So that's why you're asking these questions of yourself and developing a strategy and an approach as you go along so that you can be mindful of those things. So again, the latter of kind of determining at the outset what the message is that you'd like to share is not an inaccurate way to do it. As long as you take measures, like I said, to ensure that you're checking yourself, you're checking your work, and that it makes the most sense to go about it that way. So this is done a lot of times for marketing purposes, and that may be what you need it for. So if you already have a lot of foundational knowledge in the area, or you're looking to reach an audience you've long been trying to reach and you already have background knowledge in the area, this might be a completely acceptable approach for you. If you aren't quite committed to your exact message or your exact reason for doing the story work and what you're ultimately going to come away with, but you know you want to share more about the work that your organization is doing, then you could go about it more in that inquisitive kind of research-focused way, and that would probably better suit you. So like we talked about how you'll ultimately construct your story, you'll determine your platform, and so that also will adjust kind of how you go about things. So if you're going to need to collect things that are, you know, images, digital, interviews, artifacts, photographs, if it's all going to be verbally done, if you have numeric data and scholarly articles you're drawing from, all these different types of data coming together, that too is going to help shape the decisions you make about how you share your story and the direction that you take. So these are some research methods that are pretty rigorous, qualitative research methods that most likely you're not going to dive into any one of these to work on a story strategy for your organization. But I would encourage you to gain some familiarity with them if any of these speak to you. I'll kind of describe them briefly because there's a lot of tools, a lot of tactics within them that might serve you, that you could draw from, and it'll help to really tighten up and shape your storytelling strategy. So narrative inquiry is a method of relaying everyday stories. So it's what it sounds like. So we think about people narrating something, narrating like a biography of some kind. It's a similar feeling to that, but it's an actual process that you go through. So it's a method of relaying everyday stories to understand social patterns. So that's really at the core of what narrative inquiry is about. So these depictions of life experiences are detailed in a more biographical way, like I said. The information is pieced together from longer form interviews and observations, and you would collect interesting facts about a person's lived experience and really approach this in a way of spending quality time with the handful of people you're going to collectively put together into a larger story and represent. So it's definitely a more involved process than just like sending out a survey or doing a couple of quick interviews, but it may lend itself toward a larger or longer format story presentation, perhaps something you share with internal stakeholders, or if you have like a large presentation that you're providing to people who have contributed or you hope to contribute to your organization in some way, it might be beneficial for that.
Monica,
yeah.
Cindy here. So as you're thinking about gathering all this data and stuff, one question that's come up is, what about privacy expectations, ethics in the work, and as you start to interact with the people?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So, and if you look into some of these methods, they have suggestions about how to go about that for this type of qualitative, very human-based, oftentimes non-numerical data where you are trying to relay someone's lived experience and personal story. But objectivity and subjectivity are definitely an issue all the time when dealing with research, but certainly when dealing with humans in this way, in the human story. And then anonymity and privacy is also a part of that whole construct. So different organizations handle it different ways. Sometimes people will sign things where they say, yes, please share my story. I want it to be a part of whatever you're working on. Particularly, we're about ready to talk about some of the digital aspects of things. If you are going to video people or there's going to be photographs involved, typically organizations would want to get some sort of waiver or something like that for people to be involved. If they don't want their identity to be called out, which in some storytelling scenarios for lived experiences that are extremely painful, or the person just would really like for their own personal reasons to remain anonymous, there's still options for being able to include that data. Then you might switch to something more written and have it be an anonymous account that you include in something. Or there are ways to do digital where someone else provides the actual audio voice for that person to hide the identity of that person, but their story still gets shared. As far as legality of it, it's definitely just an agreement between you and the participants. But everybody knows their organization's data best. So if there are some aspects of it that seem like they lend themselves more to needing more protection, that's something you would want to get advice on for sure. Thanks, Cindy.
Yep.
So ethnography is one that we talked about in design thinking. And the reason that we use ethnography through design thinking is because it is very human-centered. And so getting to that like core human emotion is important in being able to really develop and design products and services and that sort of thing for humans. So that's why we talk about ethnography. But it also, like narrative inquiry, it's very embedded and very involved. But its main trait is that it's trying to explain or describe a culture group or a community group. So if your objective is to really learn more about a particular community of people, some of the processes within the ethnography style are going to be really well suited to that. So that's something, like I said, each one of these has so much information in it that we could truly break them down and talk about each one and how it might translate to the type of storytelling work you're doing. But here's kind of an overview of these so that you at least are familiar with them if you weren't already, and you can dive into them a little bit more. Digital ethnography is exactly what it sounds like. It goes back to that question we just addressed. but it's definitely going after someone relaying their story in kind of more of a firsthand account and giving some of that visual context to things that can be very impactful in a presentation if you had to present. Connoisseurship and criticism. So this is where you have a deep, deep knowledge of a topic, of a community, of something that you're doing. If you are someone who's been a practitioner in a particular field for a long time, you may have a deep knowledge on a topic. And so this allows you to have more of a critical lens that you can apply to something. And this might be valuable when making judgment calls about different things. So if you are needing to be persuasive in your storytelling about why a particular path is important for your organization to take, and you can bring this, you can thread the stories of the people who are impacted by that throughout, you can speak to it with some or a lot of credibility and authority. And then there's arts inquiry, which of course I have to throw in because that's one of my favorites. But there are a variety of arts-based approaches, and these are very community-based approaches oftentimes. So this is bringing people in. I'm sure you've seen examples of murals where people are putting up quotes, they're adding to a list of some larger question for the community, they're drawing, they're adding photographs to it. That is such a dense way and a very community-involved way to get a lot of opinions and information from people in a small space of time and physical space oftentimes too. So that's something to look into and consider. It's also a nice way to involve your community in a very transparent way of the questions you're asking and your research process essentially on display. So that's an interesting thing you can also do. Okay. So everybody likes a data visualization too. So we can talk a lot about human story, and there can be videos of people sharing their stories. But data visualizations can sometimes be just a really beautiful, succinct way to tell a story in a graphical image, particularly if you're looking to share something out via social media. Or in a quick way, or you need it to be a part of a presentation, and your presentation or the information you're sharing is very, very dense, and you need something to kind of offer some lightness to it in terms of a design approach. So these are just some of my favorite people that I follow. There are tons and tons of great data visualization examples out there, and they can be extremely simple or very complex in terms of being interactive, where you point and click on different things and the visualization changes. But these are a great way to add. So again, thinking back to that, how you construct your story and thinking about who my audience is and how I'm going to share the information with them. If it's truly going to be the community at large as your audience, then getting something out there on a social media platform may be the best way. If it is to a core group of stakeholders that you are going to stand in front of and speak, then an impactful human story with maybe a visualization to accompany it is a way to go. So these are all options, and this is still an example of storytelling. So I think sometimes people think storytelling is truly just standing up on a stage and sharing a story, but it's really more of a concept of that arc of a story and the arc of the information that we know, and then how we gather the data and what we choose to include in the ultimate story that we share. So a visualization is a nice way of thinking of that also. So I mentioned community involvement a little bit with the arts-based approach to things. But involving the community in something you've already done and weaving those stories together is really important. So this would be if you have a bunch of information already, but you need some more kind of firsthand accounts or human elements to it. It's nice to bring those in if you can reach out to your network, to participants in your organization via social media again, something along those lines, and really start to gather comments or gather feedback. You can do it in a survey, certainly, when you're reaching out via social media or even like first person, it's going to have a different type of response than sending out a survey. Sometimes you get more information, sometimes you get less. It just kind of depends on who it is that you're talking to. So think about who the community person, the stakeholder, the participant, think about who that is that you're talking to as a group and how best to reach them and really get the information that you want. Because again, it may not be like demographic information at this point that you're seeking, but maybe more of an experience you'd really like someone to elaborate on. Okay, so this is a lot of information that we're kind of cramming into the space of time. And like I said, we can definitely talk about each one of these strategies and each one of these methods and how that might relate more specifically to your organization. But broadly, this is these are some of the tools that you can use. And so with all of that information, you are, like everything, going to have to make a lot of choices. So we talked at the beginning about making some choices, or at least identifying what platform you plan to use, who your audiences are going to be for this information, and kind of the direction that you would like to go. But once you start to collect your stories and collect your data, and you start to see what makes sense and where things fit, then you're going to have to make more choices about what you keep, what you maybe don't need to keep in your ultimate story. Maybe you shift platforms or what's included. Maybe you didn't have a visual at first, and then you decide a visual will help to emphasize clarity of your message. So you are going to have to make some of those choices and just decide what's important, what are the important details that you know about your organization's story you're trying to tell, or the community story, and what of that is really key and essential that you want people to focus on, and not let it get lost in too much of the stuff that's maybe not as important to share. So I had to throw books in, as I do in every one of my presentations, because I am a librarian by original trade. So I like to think about this in terms of a collection. So whether that be a collection in your experience, in your mind, whether it be actual transcripts and photos and videos and written work that's tangible or digital, over time, as an individual and certainly as an organization, a researcher and a community storyteller, if you move toward that direction, you'll start to build this collection of data and human stories. And so approaching your work with that collection in mind can be really valuable. It's like gathering knowledge from a personal library that you're creating, whether this collection, like I said, is however form it comes in. You're collecting thoughts, accounts, experiences, personal stories, and those don't just go away or are not relevant to other stories you may tell. So you may be collecting these things for a particular purpose, a particular marketing campaign, program you're trying to develop, funders you'd like to speak to, that sort of thing, but they will carry through and likely be something that you can use later, especially if you've really gathered a nice depth of information, a nice depth of stories that do share what your organization's message is about, then that's something that you really want to hang on to those as a collection. And then, like I said, a collection of experience also references your own experience as a researcher, as a storyteller. There may be some experience you had in interviewing somebody that then informs how you interview many people to come after that. So having that kind of collection mindset will make it much easier. So speaking back to kind of those fears at the beginning, or those hesitancies, or not knowing quite where to start with the process, if you can go through each one with that collection mindset, it helps to know that with each time that you go through this process, you'll develop your own kind of style with it, style that reflects you, style that reflects the type of work that you are embedded in. and it will get easier the next time, and you'll start to really collect that skill set as well. So I would love to do a little bit of breakout time today and talk about, which I meant to mention at the beginning and I didn't. So hopefully people will be able to stick around just a little bit. I just want to do a short breakout and bring people back so that we can answer more questions. If other people have questions for one another or for me, we can come back and do that. But if we could quickly just be in some breakout groups just to kind of go over like what drew you to this topic or what is drawing you to this topic. We've talked about it in a couple of different ways now on this series. And so, and there's obviously more content we could move forward with also, but just what drew you to this topic today? And or is there some story, even if it's just a very kind of loose abstract thought at this point, but is there some story that your organization is really hoping to tell, and you feel like maybe this is going to be helpful and this is where your thought process is at right now? So if we could jump into breakout groups, kind of just quickly chat about those things, and then we'll bring you back as a larger group and we can answer those questions or others.
Monica, one thing maybe this just might help people as they're in their group is someone's asking about like what differentiates stories from like a great story versus a mediocre one. Are there things that you can give them as a little guidance? Just, better things that make better stories as they start to think through this.
Yeah, so I think kind of thinking about what I mentioned as far as that arc of the story, think about, you're really looking at the story from a true storytelling or true writing perspective of you need to have like a little bit of background information, and then you want it to build as that community or whatever story that is, their experience is really going to expand what happened. Sometimes there's like a peak in the story, a turning point, some sort of decision that was made that shifted perspectives, those sorts of things. And then what happened there afterward and where are we at now? So kind of thinking about it in an organized fashion helps to organize the thought process around it. So that's helpful. Sometimes it's going to be determined based on who you're talking to also, and what gets included and what doesn't. But going back to that, just because you have all of this information doesn't mean that like everybody needs to have all of the information. So being selective about what you share, not to be dishonest about the information or the facts that you're sharing, but rather just to curate the facts so that people get exactly what they need to be impactful, especially if you have a short period of time in front of somebody to persuade or convince or inspire or motivate. That's like high stakes, high pressure. So you want to really like pick the things that are going to have the most impact. So that would be my general advice. Okay, so as we're getting everybody back, I did want to answer a question that was in our chat from Marvin. He asked if we could go back and discuss a little more broadly about connoisseurship. And yes, so connoisseurship and criticism are really interesting to take a look at. They were kind of born, connoisseurship was born out of education for the most part. And criticism has been a part of the humanities as far as like art criticism and everything like that for a long time, but it bridged its way over to the social sciences and community-based research because there were these people who had embedded themselves so much in a community of people in a field of professionalism that they had gained so much information about, particularly in the education realm, it was around curriculum. And so being an expert in curriculum, they were then able to critique it in a way that you would like an art critic or something. That was kind of the thought process that it was born out of, all with the intention of making improvements in curriculum. However, since then, connoisseurship has evolved, and it's really about, if you think about being like a wine connoisseur or any sort of connoisseur where you really develop a deep base of knowledge that you can speak to, that's what you would be aiming for by using that methodology as kind of a support structure for your storytelling. So if you are a practitioner who's been in a particular field, particular organization section of the nonprofit sector, that might suit you because you might be able to really draw from, like we talked about at the end, that collection of knowledge or collection of experiences, data, etc., that you have gathered over time. You might be able to draw from that and really jump into some of the tools and tactics that method encourages. So it's just another one to take a look at. Really, they're all mindsets, and they're all about who is it that I'm talking to, and who is it that I'm talking to, and who is it that I'm trying to relay the information to, and what's the best way to really get the most knowledge out of that situation. So some are going to be better suited than others, and you can, of course, blend and borrow for the purposes of creating your own style for your organization. So does anybody have any takeaways from their very quick chat in the breakout group? But I did want to do just a quick breakout if anyone wanted to just share anything about what's drawn them to this, our storytelling sessions. We've had a couple of them now. Or if you have any questions as far as kind of what your organization is trying to do that I can weigh in on, or others here can weigh in on. And you just feel free to speak up too. You can put it in the chat or just unmute yourself.
Monica, in our group, we kind of just went around and did introductions, and we discussed the challenge of trying to engage with an audience who maybe doesn't have a wide range of knowledge around what you're trying to communicate or is not interested. But I mean, there's still value in trying to get new viewers or new audience members to engage with your story, and to try and broaden your range and amplify your voice. And we're just kind of like comparing experiences and talking about the challenges we face with that.
Yeah, I think getting people to be interested in really anything sometimes can be a challenge. So when you are putting together something, making sure first that who's doing it, who's doing the work and the story collecting is really bought in will help, like from the get-go, that'll help so that you have that enthusiasm behind it. But then who you're sharing it with or who you're trying to ask questions of in the community and getting people to participate, if you have that foundation of enthusiasm from the people who are doing it with that really strong purpose, minded kind of drive, that will help. That helps a lot. And then being really organized at the start of what you need to collect. So it's not so much going out and kind of like rambling to people, but knowing ahead of time, okay, like I know that we're getting some resistance, or maybe I feel like this is going to be challenging. So to at least start, I'm going to have just a couple of really succinct questions, and I can always come back to that person. It might be something where you need to like build a relationship with an organization, or with a community, or with the individual that you're talking to. And so that might take some time. So it might be like quick and seem like that person is really uninterested for the first few times. But if you keep going back and build that trust and that relationship that you are truly trying to authentically, respectfully share their information and their story, then you hope that the trust will build. So that helps too.
It seems kind of obvious, but I hadn't really thought about it in that way before. But a realization I just had is it almost seems kind of lazy to assume that you can just form a relationship via like digitally, which I guess is a real challenge right now. And you could really benefit from building a in-person relationship first and then transferring that relationship online when the time is right.
Yeah, I mean, obviously these are super unique times. And so it's navigating that balance of what makes sense. There are great examples of people who have developed great relationships via email, even written correspondence, but we're talking about a major commitment to relationship building at that point, which may or may not suit the purposes of what you're trying to go for. So if it is possible, face-to-face human connection when talking about human story is typically going to yield you better, quicker results. Especially if you're able, like if you can show that you're really also putting yourself out there to do this, because sharing this work and gathering these stories is a vulnerable place to be. So you have to accept that vulnerability, because you're putting yourself in front of someone and you're asking questions. You may or may not know what they're going to say, if they're going to be interested in you at all. So there's a degree of vulnerability on the researcher, the storyteller's part. There's an enormous amount of vulnerability on the person giving the story. So if you can like remember kind of that dynamic and have that in mind too, and be empathetic to that, that will build that relationship in a quicker fashion as well. But show your vulnerability would be my advice, I guess, from that part.
You mind if I hop in here? I'm coming at this from 30 plus years in journalism. You know, I'm sort of transitioning to telling stories for nonprofits. And what I always did, the only thing I always remember when I was doing interviews, it's what you always hear all the time is you listen more than you talk. So I mean, I think some people get a little worried about, scared that it's an interview, but I just went into it as a conversation. You know, you don't really, you know, it's just, you're interested in that person, you want their story, you know, you just listen more than you talk. And the more you kind of try and make it, the more you worry about it, the harder it's going to be.
Yeah, like all things, right? At least in my experience, the more you worry about it, the harder it is. I know that well. But I completely agree with you. I think that you'll get a lot further if you do a lot more listening. I think too, that genuine interest level in what's going on, I mean, that can be read by the person that you're talking to. So if you are truly, genuinely listening, then you're going to get more out of that conversation. Also, if you're doing more of the talking and they're doing less of the talking, to your point, I mean, you just aren't going to walk away with a whole lot of information that you can use. So
no, I mean, it's a conversation. I mean, it's just like a normal conversation. If they say something, write down the point that you want to follow up on, and then when they're finished, you ask them the question. I mean, it's simply just like talking to your friend or something over coffee.
yeah, absolutely. So I'm looking if there's any other questions. Does anyone have any other takeaways or any other questions?
Monica, this is Chad. I was just going to add just to the last one, just real quick. I love that when you mentioned about genuineness and authenticity and that credibility. And if we are doing that listen first and the act of listening, we may discover that that person's passion and their interest area might not align with the organization we're representing. But if it's really about them and we're all in this together with philanthropy and community development in mind, then we may help bring them along to maybe a colleague of ours. We may represent a portion of theirs, or they may continue to contribute, but they may be more aligned. And I think if we think about them first, we'll all gain, and this we just approach it selflessly.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks for sharing that, Chad. I think too, even if you spend time with someone and you learn about their story, learn about their experience, and ultimately it doesn't make it into your presentation, your report, your story that you're sharing, it's thinking back. That's why I always think of that collection mindset, because what it might do is enhance your experience. And so that sounds really selfish, but it's with the idea in mind that it makes you a better connector, it makes you a better storyteller, so that person shifted your perspective in some way and it felt really meaningful, and maybe it doesn't exactly fit with what you're needing to do for this project, but it completely fits with the concept of telling the human story. So if you can have that collection mindset and then just have that gratitude for that person's experience, and it will come back to you, I feel, in future stories you're trying to tell. Yeah. So we're at 9:30. I'll stick around for a few minutes if anyone else has any other questions or takeaways, but thank you very much for being a part of today's session. I really appreciate it.